The way they define therapy is a remedy, cure, a process designed to remedy, cure, or abate a disease, disability, or problem. And if we look at the core coaching competencies, what we see is that coaching is not necessarily about fixing something that's broken. It's about designing actions, setting goals, holding people accountable. So we're going to start actually by talking a little bit about how coaching is different from therapy. So if a client comes to you and asks, is this something that I should talk to a coach about or something that I should talk to a therapist about? How would y'all go about answering? Like, how do you decide whether something is appropriate for you to discuss with with a client? Like, how do y'all know what is appropriate for coaching or what is appropriate for therapy? How do y'all think about that?
Whether it involves diagnosis.
Okay. So, Jake, help me understand why that's important.
I can't diagnose anything, and if there's a clinical illness there, then that's just kind of out of my skill set.
Okay. All right. What do other people think?
I draw that line kind of at the we can talk about it in both, honestly, but it's what we work on that's different. So in coaching, we work on awareness, becoming more familiar with whatever the issue is, getting more information about it, and then therapy would be more treatment of the issue and kind of direct response to whatever's going on.
Okay, great. So all right. So I think that's a good perspective as well, that you can talk about it in coaching, but that treatment or therapy has a particular direction. Anyone else have ideas?
For me, it's when I get the certain sentiment when we're talking about specific mental health issues, and we start actually using medical terms, and then when I get the sentiment that they're looking for me to answer that or come up with a actual solution to a specific mental health issue, that's when I usually start that conversation with the client.
Okay. So let me ask y'all a question. So if we can't diagnose and treat medical conditions, what do we do? How do we help people?
We help them understand themselves more, to sort of take agency or control over their mental health. But in a way, through coaching is through creating something good from it.
Okay. Other people have thoughts? Thanks, Kent.
Yeah, I think one thing that we definitely do is emotional awareness, helping them become aware of their emotional state, how that gets in the way of what they want to do.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good way to put it. So what we're going to do, so this is these are the opinions of you as coaches, right? So what we're going to do is take a step back from y'all's opinions, which I'll summarize in a second. We're actually going to look at different organizations and different pieces of data from therapy and coaching, and we'll sort of let y'all kind of see whether your answer is right or wrong, okay? So what I'm hearing, first of all, is that we're not, licensed mental health professionals that we're not able to diagnose and treat particular medical conditions or any medical conditions, which I agree with 100%. And at the same time, the reason that we talk about things let's say, anxiety or whatever negative emotions you have is to raise awareness of them. And once you have awareness of them, you can actually use that information or understanding to succeed in whatever goals or targets you set for yourself. Is that fair to say? Right? So we're about increasing understanding, but for the purpose of application. So the first thing that host is disabled screen sharing. Okay. Can we screen share, please? We have certain ethical responsibilities that we adhere to. I think y'all understand this very well. Things like privacy and stuff like that, mandatory reporting, all that kind of stuff falls into here. So co-creating the relationship, so establishing trust and intimacy with the client, the ability to create a safe, supportive environment that produces ongoing mutual respect and trust. I think this also makes a lot of sense. Coaching presence, the ability to be fully conscious and create spontaneous relationship with a client, employing a style that is open, flexible, and confident. We want to be present, flexible. It's all this kind of feel good coaching presence. Oh man, using his humor to create a lightness and energy. That's great. It's like all this like, okay, fine, like what is this? Like, how does this help anyone? Okay, so this is like the early stuff. Okay, we'll get to interesting things. So now we get to number 5, which is active listening. So this is where, we train y'all to be like very active listeners, to, pick up on things that clients may not understand themselves. Also overlaps a lot with what you see in therapy training, right? So therapists are also trained listeners. Powerful questioning. I think this also kind of it has overlap between coaching and therapy, where coaches are really good at, we try to be competent at asking important questions that sort of catalyze insight. Also very common in therapy, or necessary in therapy. So direct communication. So I'd say that all 3 of these things are like very similar in therapy, but we'll see that in a second, okay? So active listening, powerful questioning, and direct communication. Okay, so like all this is fine and all, but it's still kind of fluffy stuff, right? So why would you kind of go to a coach? And so this is where I think coaching and therapy really starts to differentiate, but y'all can judge yourselves. And then we get to number 8, which is creating awareness. So y'all have sort of said, we try to help our clients understand things. So the ability to integrate and accurately evaluate multiple sources of information and to make interpretations that help the client to gain awareness and thereby achieve agreed upon results. So this is sort of exactly what y'all were talking about earlier, right? So the goal of coaching is to increase awareness, and the goal of that is to leverage that increased understanding to help someone achieve what they want to in life. Designing actions. So this is the ability to create, work. I guess this is a grammatical error. The ability to work with a client to create opportunities for ongoing learning during coaching and in work-life situations, and for taking new actions that will most effectively lead to the agreed upon coaching results. So now we sort of start to see that a big part of coaching is like setting out kind of plans and designing actions that are tailored to the individual shortcomings, strengths, and weaknesses of a particular client. And then we get to planning and goal setting. So this is a core part. Like if we're talking about, the 11 things that coaches are supposed to do, a big part of it is understanding, designing actions, planning and goal setting, and then managing progress and accountability. So this is like another important thing, which is that coaches, oftentimes when clients come to us, we'll sort of set targets for them, or they'll set targets for themselves. And it's our job to kind of be there and sort of help them work through if they run into trouble or like what's going on. And eventually we want to get to the client to where their goal is. Okay, so that's coaching. I think that's, yeah. So those are the 11 things. Now let's take a look at therapy, okay? So this is the National Association of Social Workers. So social workers in the United States are the largest percentage of therapists. So the highest number of therapists in the US are actually clinical social workers. So let's see what they say about what therapy is. Okay, so they have these different standards, but that's a little bit different. It's not really what their practice is. Okay, so clinical social workers represent the largest group of behavioral health practitioners in the nation. They're often the first to diagnose and treat people with mental disorders and various emotional and behavioral disturbances. They are essential to a variety of client-centered settings, blah, blah, blah. Clinical social work has a primary focus on the mental, emotional, and behavioral well-being of individuals, couples, families, and groups. It centers on a holistic approach to psychotherapy and the client's relationship to his or her environment. Clinical social work views the client's relationship with his or her environment as essential to treatment planning. So I'm going to pause here for a second, and I'm just going to ask y'all, what do y'all see as the difference between the approach in coaching and the approach in clinical social work? If any. Or would y'all say that they're the same?
It kind of seems like in therapy, the social worker is kind of choosing what it is and kind of diagnosing what it is about the client's life that they feel like needs improvement. Whereas in coaching, it's more client-centered as far as what they want to work on.
Okay, that's a really good point. So I don't know that I'd entirely agree that coaching is more client-centered, but I would completely agree that generally speaking, therapists are working with a preconceived model of diagnosis and treatment. So the process that they go through, right? So if we kind of look at they're often the first to diagnose and treat people with mental disorders and various emotional and behavioral disturbances. That clinical social work views the client's relationship with his or her environment as essential to treatment planning. So I'm with you there, that they definitely use a particular framework that they kind of slot people into. Other people have thoughts about, what's different, if anything?
I'm not saying this to be rude, but it almost sounds like it takes the human out of it.
Okay. Yeah, so I would say that that's just an unfair representation, because we're kind of comparing apples and oranges here.
Gotcha.
In the sense that this is just the introduction to the document, and we were far more detailed. So maybe the human will emerge. We'll actually look at a curriculum in a second and further that out. Other thoughts? Okay. So next thing that we're going to kind of look at is if we look at how a clinical social worker is trained, right? So these are the core competencies that ICF coaches are trained in, right? About designing actions, goal setting and planning, accountability. So, this is the important thing, is that if you look at clinical social work, so it's state regulated, that's fantastic. Coaching is completely unregulated. Anyone can say, hey, I'm a coach, and can start charging people for coaching. So I think what we see is there's a minimum of 2 years or 3,000 hours in a supervised clinical setting. So I think the key thing that I sort of notice here is that, clinical social work is clinical. So therapy is clinical in nature, and that's something that we've also talked about. And that if you kind of look at it, it's about treatment planning. It's about taking a holistic approach, absolutely, to the client and the relationship with their environment and things like that. But that overall, clinical social workers are trained in a model that's primarily clinical, focuses on diagnosis and treatment. So let's see if we kind of go down for a second, and let's just look at the definition of clinical social work. So clinical social work is the professional application of social work theory and methods to the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of psychosocial dysfunction, disability, or impairment, including emotional, mental, and behavioral disorders, right? So this is how the National Association of Social Workers defines therapy. And if you guys look at this, what I kind of see is the emphasis is on diagnosis and treatment of different kinds of disability, dysfunction. It doesn't necessarily have to include a diagnosis, right? So therapists don't have to work with people who only have diagnoses. But their goal is absolutely treatment and prevention of particular kinds of dysfunction, disability, or mental disorder. If we kind of look at, psychotherapy. So psychotherapy is a specialized formal interaction between a social worker or other mental health professional and a client, in which a therapeutic relationship is established in order to help resolve symptoms of a mental disorder, psychosocial stress, relationship problems, and difficulties in coping in the social environment. So then they'll kind of go into different options. And then they kind of define therapy as a systematic process designed to remedy, cure, or abate some disease, disability, or problem. So this is the key thing that I want y'all to understand. So if you look at the largest organization of therapists in the United States, the way they define therapy is a remedy, cure, a process designed to remedy, cure, or abate a disease, disability, or problem. And if we look at the core coaching competencies, what we see is that coaching is not necessarily about fixing something that's broken. It's about designing actions, setting goals, holding people accountable. So I think about, and this is kind of is a no-brainer when I sort of say it this way, but clinical work is about pathology, right? So as a clinician, if you look at the training of social workers, if you look at the accreditation of social workers, if you look at therapists, medical doctors are even more so this way, because we're even more medicalized than social workers. I think social workers in that way are far more holistic, pay attention to relationships and environment and stuff way more than medical doctors do. But really the goal of coaching is, I kind of think about it as moving forward, whereas opposed to, or building something new, as opposed to therapy, which I really think about is focusing on pathology or fixing something that's broken. So the big difference for me in terms of whether someone is appropriate for coaching or someone is appropriate for therapy is what's the primary goal? Is the primary goal to fix something that's broken, or is it to actually achieve something and have some kind of, even if there are things in the way? So I'll give you all kind of an example. So let's say my goal is okay, I want to get rid of my depression because I feel depressed. So that's something that a clinician should do. Whereas if I want to, switch jobs, but I feel like burnout and depressed, if the goal is switching jobs, some amount of emotional awareness may be necessary as a coach to help them in achieving their goals. And that's kind of why we focus on awareness and understanding. It's not to fix the problem per se. In clinical treatment, treating depression is the end goal. Whereas in coaching, the reason that we work with, clients' depression and anxiety, we're not trying to treat it. It's a means to an end. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Okay. So if y'all want to, we can take a second to just look at like the actual curriculum and training of, an actual, psychology curriculum. So this is like a PsyD program. But if you kind of look at this, like, what are they trained in? So adult psychopathology, like development, assessment, like intelligence tests and things like that. History and systems of psychology, like psychopathology, like let's look at adult intervention 1 and let's just see what they say. So this is just a course that's not focused on psychopathology. So this course covers primary approaches to treating adult clinical problems, right? With an emphasis on treating adult Axis 1 disorders. So we can see that if you look at like PsyD curriculums and like PhD curriculums and therapy curriculums, like let's take a look at supervision. We'll kind of see what the focus here is. So let's read some of this. So students will prepare supervision by obtaining and utilizing data about current historical formulation, behavioral assets, making excesses to make diagnostic determinations, treatment formulations, translating clinical questions. So administering, scoring, interpreting, and integrating reports from psychological testing results, providing consultation, by beginning to provide individual couples, family, and group treatment, and evaluate the efficacy thereof, and it kind of goes on, right? So incorporating current empirical theoretical findings into assessment, treatment, and consultation. So if you kind of look at the training of a psychologist or a therapist, most of it is going to be like clinical in nature. So it's going to be focused on pathology, focusing on people who are like coming to clinics. So there are people who are, seeking medical treatment for some kind of thing. Now, a lot of psychologists will say, and I would agree with this, that or therapists will say that, we don't just focus on the clinical stuff, we do non-clinical things as well, which makes perfect sense. We saw that in clinical social work definition, right? That they sort of do things that are not necessarily diagnosing and treating. But if you look at the training and perspective, it's all kind of focused on pathology. Like that's what the actual training is in. Whereas if you look at the training of coaching, it's really more about, goal setting, motivation, designing actions, supporting people to like achieve what they want to.